Watch this. No way!
Hello and welcome back to the Cookie Jar Golf Podcast. I am Tom Mills and today I'm joined by Bruce Fitzpatrick.
Hello.
And we have a very special guest. This guest has had a hand in the renovation and the restoration of courses such as Merion, Fisher's Island, Pinehurst number 4, Wingfoot, which famously had the US Open this year, played on it, and of course the design of the 2016 Olympic golf course. But that's not why we've got him on today. Today we're going to be talking about Castle Stuart Golf Club, and we have world-famous architect Gil Hanse. Gil, thank you for joining us on Thanksgiving.
Oh, you're welcome, guys. Thank you. It's fun to be with you.
Oh, yeah. Well, how's your Thanksgiving going so far? Is it going well?
Good. It was yesterday was the big day, so we had feasted and probably gained 2 or 3 pounds, which is
yeah.
fun. The eating part's good, but the morning, I said last night, I'm not getting on the scale this morning. We'll give it a day or two.
No, absolutely. Yeah, let it go. Today we've just finished filming a series up in Scotland, and we were lucky enough to play at Castle Stuart, and we'd like to sort of, as the designer of Castle Stuart, have a chat to you about it and how you got involved with it, really. So I think the easiest way is to start from the beginning, Gil. How did you get involved with Castle Stuart?
So we had our very first golf course that we ever did was at Craighead, Crail Golfing Society down the road from King's Barnes. And we were finishing up about the time that Mark Parsinen was kind of getting involved at King's Barnes. And he had come over and seen what we did. And, you know, obviously the sites are completely different, Craighead to King's Barnes. But he, I think, saw that there was something in what we were doing. And then just by happenstance, we had a mutual friend, Colin Sheehan, who was having dinner with Mark in New York City, invited me to come along. And this was about the time Mark was planning to get ready to go up to Castle Stuart. And so we had a really good chat about possibly getting involved with him, much as he had worked with Kyle Phillips at King's Barnes. And Mark invited me to come over to Scotland and walk the site with him, which he had already identified for all the various characteristics of what he thought would make for good links golf. And yeah, then all of a sudden we were working together, which was fantastic.
Wow. And what year was this?
That would have been probably 2006, 2005, okay. 2006. We broke ground in 2007 on Castle Stuart.
Yeah. For those of our listeners that don't know, Mark Parsinen was a visionary in himself and was heavily involved in King's Barnes beforehand, and obviously has a very keen eye for this sort of thing. What was it like working with him?
Mark was a genius, and unfortunately left us way too early. He was just brilliant in everything that he observed and thought about golf. It's interesting when you get into these collaborations, you never know which way they're going to go. Are they going to be good? Are you going to battle? Or are you going to fight? But I know Jim Wagner, my partner, and I, we learned so much from Mark. I mean, he was so thoughtful about design, about the average golfer, how they appreciate and approach golf, how golf courses need to be playable, wide, linksy. He focused an awful lot as well on the visual dynamics of the site. I mean, lining up a lot of the holes at Castle Stuart to take advantage of distant views, over to Fortrose and Rosemarkie or over to the Black Isle, down the Murray Firth. So there were a lot of things that Mark really brought to the table for us. And we love the opportunity. I mean, we've always been focused on designing in the field, and Mark gave us basically the biggest canvas we'd ever worked on to that point to design in the field. And with him step by step with us, and Stuart McComb, the other lieutenant on the project. Obviously, Stuart had worked at King's Barnes alongside Mark. So we had a great team, all of us pulling in the same direction. Although at the start it was interesting. There was a little bit of, as Mark said, when we needed to find the code. It was both teams, and you hate to say it because it really, at the end of the day, was such a great partnership. But it was sort of like Jim and I coming to the project from one team, and Mark and Stuart from the other team, and it was you kind of bounce around each other a little bit. How who gets the final say and who does this and et cetera. And to Mark's everlasting credit, he could have done this at every single turn, but he never once pulled the owner card. He never once said, hey, I'm the owner. This is the way I want it. He was willing to discuss and talk a subject to the death and really just get into it so much that you're constantly looking over things and talking until everybody on the team came out of it feeling good about what we built. And that's an amazing quality for any human being, no matter what you do, whether it's architecture or business. But he was just, he was a tremendous, tremendous man.
Well, Stuart McCollum is actually still involved there, isn't he? Do you think he's running the whole place? So that's, it's great that he can still be there.
It is, yeah. Stuart understands everything that we tried to accomplish when we were building the place. He obviously understands Mark's philosophies. I don't know if you read in the Yardage book. There's a couple of Mark's quotes and his just basically, I don't want to say a manifesto. That's a little too strong a word, but it really was his beliefs on golf architecture and the playability and how Castle Stuart was founded and the principles behind the design, et cetera. And it's one of the most fascinating bits of writing. And Mark chose every word extremely carefully. I mean, that was the one thing that I think we all shared, Jim, Mark, Stuart, and I, was just that attention to detail, that love of getting everything just right down to the final rake mark before the seat hit the ground. And I think that's really evident in Mark's writing as well.
Well, I think the routing is certainly something I want to get on to shortly, because I genuinely believe it's some of the most astounding routing that I've ever played, and ingenious in the way that it leads your eye places. How did that collaboration with Mark work? Did you work together on the routing, or was it mostly your design team, or how did that work?
It was actually mostly Mark. Mark had spent a lot more time on site prior to us coming there. And so he had a lot of observations and a lot of ideas that he brought to the table. And then he asked us to look at it and almost deconstruct it and see if we could figure out a better way. And, his beliefs were focused a lot on the quality of the ground. Was more, since we were manufacturing the links anyway, he felt like the holes down along the water were going to have a sense of place. But he thought that was a better sense of place to start the front nine and the back nine, as opposed to finishing down there. Again, sort of also the transport up to the top. But he felt like the upper shelves, holes 5 through 9, and then also holes 13 through 18 on the back were really the important part of the puzzle, to basically be up above and experience the views, the long distance views, but also the views back down over the water. So we were quite happy the way he had organized it. And he obviously had a lot of change of direction. And I think the major changes that we made to his routing were holes 2 and 3. 3 became a shorter par 4. 2 became a little bit longer par 5. And then the way that 11 and 12, kind of 10, 11, 12, changing those around. They were in a different order. It was 10, and 11 was a hole that played up top, and then you played a par 3. Before he made the transition to 13. So it was, really just minor tweaking. A couple holes on the front, couple holes on the back. But Mark had pretty much laid out everything when we got started. I
mean, when you say a sentence, Gil, I just want to take it 15 different ways, because there's genuinely so much to talk about here. And I'm conscious that I don't want to miss a lot of these things. But you talked about the elevation. I mean, it's interesting when you play Castle Stuart, because although you've got essentially 3 tiers of play along that cliff, you don't really see the other holes. It's genuinely bizarre. When you're above them, you don't see the below, and when you're below, you don't see above. And it's a fascinating way that it's been put together. But with that routing being parallel to the Moray Firth, was it quite difficult to resist the temptation to use that elevation within the holes as opposed to between the holes? So like have a sweeping downhill par 4, or was it quite tricky to resist that temptation?
There were one reason we couldn't, which was a practical one, was all the gorse, the banks on the sea cliff. The badgers lived in there, so we weren't allowed to go through there because they were protected, which is odd in and of itself, because through all the years the Highland they basically killed off the badgers because they're killing sheep, and now all of a sudden they're protected because there are very few of them. So from a practical standpoint, we weren't allowed to go in and clear the gorse, but from a design standpoint, Mark talked an awful lot about the believability of a site, and that if we're going to create contours and we're going to create the way the hole's set there, that there has to be some part of the fabric of the landscape that allows it to be believable, like it existed prior to the golf course being there. So then it connects the lower holes to the upper holes, and that sea cliff or that bank and the mature gorse on it was really our only opportunity to have that sort of connection back to the original landscape. So it was for those reasons, the practical one and as well as the design one, we decided that it was better to use that as our separation as opposed to a transition. And then getting to Mark's attention to detail, the walk from the 6th hole at Royal Dornoch up to the 7th hole, we literally went out there and we walked, and how many steps is it up that hill, and how many steps our 12th hole up to the 13th hole? Yeah,
that's a big hill.
Because if anybody wanted to ever complain about it, Mark wanted to have it literally in his hands to say, no, it's less steps and obvious, and the change in elevation is actually less. So we worked really hard at getting the 12th green up to a point where that slower.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so that's the attention to detail that he brought to it. And then we talked, there's, I don't know if it's still there, but the token you get when you start the round of golf, so that you could get a ginger beer or something, which again harkens back to the origins of the game. So a little bit of before you head up that hill.
So in terms of, you mentioned that you went to Dornoch and did that walk. Were there many inspiration from a lot of Scottish courses? Did you take a lot of inspiration, and from which courses were you kind of borrowing ideas?
Yeah, Dornoch was definitely one that we spent a lot of time studying. There was the I always get this wrong, but this the Dornoch. I think we called it the Dornoch 412, which is the relationship between the 4th hole and the 12th hole. I think that's right. In that, this sort of side to side, the elevation change was kind of a sharper landform between them, and we utilized that. That was part of Mark saying when he talked about getting the code right. There were these little code words like, okay, go to Dornoch 412 or go to St. Andrew's Rumpel, or these sort of old course Rumpel type things, and we would basically go through and we talk about these different golf courses. So I would say Dornoch and the old course were the two courses that we really referred to most during the design.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be quite difficult to create a course starting in 2005 that sits in with that landscape, because a lot of those courses there have been there for hundreds of years. Was that part of the design, like trying to make sure that it did fit in over time?
Yeah, I think that phrase, make it a believable landscape, was one of the things that we really focused on. So it was, I think, the proportionality between holes and the connectivity across the landscape was, we really talked about it. How there really are very few, if any, that I know of links golf courses in the UK that sit up on a shelf, high above the water below it. So it became, all right, that connection, how do we make this believable? How did the scale of we never wanted to build holes that sort of played through their own corridor. We wanted to build holes where landforms spanned from one hole to the next. So a ridge might bisect one hole, and then it might serve as the spot for the tee on the next hole. Yeah. Instead of just this sort of, through the mounds type setup. So there was a lot of discussion about the proportions of different types of links golf, where you're talking about the proportions of the fairways at Royal Birkdale, which are fairly benign and sort of playing in between dunes, or you're talking about the proportion of like Royal St. George's, Sandwich, where you've got these massive sort of dunes that are crashing through. So there was a lot of conversation about getting the proportions right and getting the scale right from hole to hole, because ultimately that could be read through the landscape. When you're up in the clubhouse or you're up on the back 9 holes, kind of looking down over the front, if the proportion, as everything was sort of falling to the west, if the proportion of the western, the front 9 holes was really big and high, that wouldn't make any sense. So you almost building your way up to the bigger profile stuff on the back 9.
And you mentioned fairways there, Gil. I think something that Castle Stuart almost prides itself on, or is certainly it's mentioned there when you kind of look at the course guide and an introduction to the layout, is that the fairways are actually relatively generous off the tee. And although it's hosted Scottish Opens, and I imagine that, the ambition to begin with was designing a course that could accommodate world-class golfers, but is also eminently playable for slightly higher handicaps. That seems to be something that, as you say there, like the older, more traditional links courses allow people to have some space off the tee, and they're not overly punishing. It's not like losing a ball off the tee just seems to be one of the worst things to disrupt a round of golf. And thankfully, I think at Castle Stuart, although it looks quite intimidating on certain holes off the tee boxes, there's actually quite a bit of space when you get out there.
Yeah, that was definitely part of, the two words that Mark always used, and we talked an awful lot about, and Jim and I refer to these even to this day, is he talked about keeping the golfer hopeful and engaged. And when you think about it, that's just brilliant. It is absolutely, if a golfer is hopeful, they think, okay, I can hit this shot, I can carry this off. They may not, but at least they're hopeful that the outcome is going to be a good one. And then the other part is that they're engaged. The ball's not in their pocket. They haven't lost it. It's not in a gorse bush. It's not somewhere in a pond or in the water. So they're always engaged. And, when we think about golf, Americans don't think much about it, which is a shame. But, over in the UK, it's all about match play. And if you're engaged in a match, then you're really focused. It's fun. And golf is meant to be fun in that regard. So it's one of those things where I think Mark talked to us about keeping the golfer hopeful and engaged. He talked an awful lot about, we never really viewed it in these terms, but I've subsequently come to figure out a better way to explain it, but we did talk about the level of precision required to play a golf course should be fairly generous. I mean, and when I say play, it means just go out and play and, have a good match. Whatever your capabilities are, you should be able to play it. And I think that width is important in that regard. But the level of precision required to score on that golf course or to play it well should be really off, almost off the charts. And the flexibility that you have within the setup of the golf course, the green contours, tucking pins behind bunkers or behind mounds or things. Now all of a sudden the width becomes relevant. It's easier to play, but if I'm trying to score, I need to be on the right side of the fairway or the left side of the fairway. And so through the setup of the golf course, we tried to, at Castle Stuart, and I think we probably succeeded there almost more than anywhere we've ever done it before. And it was one of the principles in Rio that we tried to implement, but it was just that whole thought process about width, playability, fun, variety, yet if by chance the Scottish Open were to show up one year, we could defend the golf course through hole locations and through angles, et cetera. But as you guys both know, the ultimate, basically what happened is the wind. It's, if the wind blows there, that golf course can play as hard as anything. But if it lays down, then it's fairly easy. And we see that when the pros show up.
Yeah. Well, it's the spirit of St Andrews right there, isn't it? It was always about everyone being able to play it, but not many people being able to score well. It was when I played with the boys at Castle Stuart, I was struck by the sort of Tom Simpson philosophy, because it is definitely a case that it's a lot more visually intimidating than it is difficult, because you can stand on those tees, and I was the victim of it many a time, stand on those tees and think, bloody hell, this looks hard. But actually, the holes that looked slightly more benign played trickier than they looked, and the ones that looked really hard played a lot more simple. We've touched upon those, the rerouting of 2 and 3, and we cannot not ask you about those infinity greens and the way they point towards these landmarks. So can you just give us a little bit of insight into the way that you designed those infinity greens and the way that you thought about pointing them visually towards things that were interesting around the area?
I think that was, again, one of the notions that we came into the project that Mark had already decided. This is going to be an important part of this golf course. And so we all need to work together to create these green complexes to be interesting, but also to have the horizon lines of the greens themselves ultimately end in a horizon that's in the distance. And so it was, we weren't going to build big mounds behind the greens and hide that. We were going to make sure that they were playable, that, not everything ran away from you so that you had a better view off the back of the green. But it was really sort of how do we almost a dual purpose in the design of designer for the playability first and foremost. And that always came first. I mean, Mark was really big on getting these views into the design, but never at the cost of building a bad golf hole. And so as a result, we looked at, how do we make the back horizon lines? And that's, I think, something that the Mackenzies and the Simpsons and they were geniuses is getting, and I think Bill Coore and Ben Crenshaw do as good a job as anybody in the modern age of just having that back horizon line flatter the landscape and the backdrop to the golf hole and not intrude on it. Sometimes these back horizon lines can get so complicated and just sort of EKG bouncing all over the place with mounds and humps and bumps, but then your eye gets distracted by that as opposed to just looking over a very simple flowing line that will then all of a sudden point you to, the bridge in Inverness. So I think that we did spend a lot of time talking about that. One of the funnier things is we started off on the 15th hole, which was not an easy one to try and figure out. And Mark had these little sketches. And he had like a little, and they were to scale. And he had these little sketches of a little man standing in sort of at the eye level. And Mark was pretty short. And Jim and I are pretty tall. And so Mark would draw this little man. And Jim Wagner would always say, is that you, Mark, or is that Gil? It needs to be a little bit higher. What's this person going to see? Mark always would get kind of, no, you smart ass dog. And go off on Jim a little bit. And then, and so then he would draw these things and say, all right, well, if we make this cut at 2.2 meters, then the eye level of this man will be able to see. And he had all these dash lines. And Jim just one point looked at him and just said, Mark, why don't you just stand here and we'll just keep pushing dirt until you can see what you want to see? Why do we have all these? And Mark just stomped away. He was out. It's like, oh, yeah, I guess we could have done it that way. But he loved the planning part of it. It really was, it was an interesting sort of left brain, right brain matchup out there on site.
And forgive me for asking, but so am I right in thinking, you'd studied under Martin Horshey before, and you received this scholarship, the William Frederick Dreer Award, having done a master's degree essentially in landscape architecture at Cornell. So you had like a formal education, as it were, in principles of course design. Was Mark of a similar kind of background, or did he? Like, where did he get his sort of eye and talent for seeing a golf course, do you think?
Yeah, he did not study this. He was, I guess, at the very start, he's a genius. Probably whatever the IQ level, he surpassed it. And I think when he put his mind to something, it was always going to be full blown. And so he loved the game of golf. He was an avid golfer. He had success. I think it was at Stanford, which is one of our top universities in the United States, and he was there at a time where a couple of guys this was just before Silicon Valley, had developed something to do with computers, and they were brilliant at what they did, but Mark was brilliant at business, and so they formed a partnership. So the two tech guys brought Mark in to run the business and actually make a reality out of it. I don't remember what the product was. And he had done quite well with that, and as a result, kind of kept moving in that direction, but was able to financially focus on his passions. His first course he did was Granite Bay in outside of Sacramento, California. And he worked with Kyle Phillips, who worked for Robert Trent Jones Jr. on that project. And that's how Kyle Phillips, who had left Robert Trent Jones Jr., wound up at Kings Barnes with Mark on that project. So it was just a passion play for Mark, and he had been successful enough to be able to follow his passions and, as with everything in his life, full bore into studying golf and studying golf architecture.
And was the ambition all along, I guess maybe it's just inevitable when you've got a sort of new course that you're building in the 21st century. Were you thinking ahead to holding a Scottish Open there, hopefully one day when you were considering the initial routing? And to what extent does that play into sort of looking at space for grandstands and the movement of spectators around a course, or is all that stuff pretty much secondary to looking at, can you get the best 18 quality holes from this parcel of land?
Mark always had aspirations for Castle Stuart to be able to host and maybe even the Open Championship at some point in time. So he, in the planning and the layout of the place, we actually built some tees that we just covered over with fescue grasses and just kind of left the landforms out there in the dirt, because Mark he didn't want there to be an option where some, how we all think we're better golfers than we are. And stupid things like, oh, there's a tee back there, let's go back there. So he didn't want anybody to have that temptation, but it was at the point where it had been planned for. And so when the Scottish Open was awarded, we could go back and basically scrape the fescue off and convert them to tees. So there was that thought process. And then there was also, we felt enough room on the adjoining properties that Mark owned, that if we had to set up all of the things that come along with the circus when tournaments come to town, that there would be an opportunity to do that. But never once did he ever ask to sacrifice the quality of the golf holes in order to accommodate, a grandstand somewhere.
Is it difficult to design a golf course that you have these ambitions that will host major tournaments, with the differences in the way that the amateur and the pro play the game? Is it difficult to design it in a way that it's engaging for both?
I think that gets back again to that whole concept of level of precision required to score. I mean, I think the general thought is, well, it's easy, you just add back tees or you increase the length, but that doesn't really impact the players at the top level. You can't make a golf course long enough now for those guys. And so I think from that standpoint, it's just, how do you add the increased length, and then how do you, through the design mainly of the green complexes? Because at the end of the day, with those players, it's all about rough and greens and firm greens. So let's just discount length. If you put them in a situation, where you've got firm fairways and balls are going to take bounces, and they're going to actually have to try and control their ball or their shot shape into a tighter area, and then to get close to a hole location, they've got to do exactly the same thing. Because tour players have worked really, really hard to get to a point where they have a very predictable outcome every time they swing a club. When they hit 7-iron, they know it's going to be 182 yards, or, back off a little bit, et cetera. There's a predictable outcome through their hard work. Yet if in the setup of a golf course, the outcome is not predictable, like if the greens are firm and they're not sure if it's going to bounce and check or bounce twice and check or not check at all, now all of a sudden you've got that mental part of the game into their head where they're not exactly sure over what they're doing, and they're having to think their way through the golf course, hopefully because of the architecture, but frequently because of the conditions and the setup of the golf course. So that's why you hear it week in and week out. Well, the course was defenseless because it had rained and it was soft, and we just saw at Augusta. And it sounds like a cop out or an excuse, but it's not, because at that level, you really need all the conditions to come together. You need wind, you need firm, you need dry, you need all those things. And when they all come together, then you see golf courses, especially links courses, sparkle and shine like they're supposed to. And I think that was part of the selection process behind going all fescue, which Stuart McComb shepherded, but Chris Haspel was our growing superintendent. Chris Haspel was the superintendent there for, I think, the first 10 years if not longer, and did an amazing job getting fescue. And so that was another part of the details is, listen, we're not going to go with the modern super grasses or anything along those lines. We're going to go with the tried and true linksy fescue grasses, because they can ultimately help to defend the golf course.
That was something I was going to ask about. Given this clean slate of being able to build a golf course where you built it, were you able to manipulate the soil composition and the greens so that you could dial it the way you wanted it to play?
We were. So we were lucky in that, or not lucky. Mark was lucky frequently, but he was always, the planning was there. So there was a predictable outcome was going to be part of this whole project, and that he knew there was sand underneath. So what we did was we basically stripped all of the topsoil and the heavier stuff wherever we found it, and we built the mounds that were along the perimeter of the property. And the gorse loves that soil. And so we planted all of that with gorse, and then we had the front 9 was basically all sand. So that was the sandier part of the property. So we didn't have to go down and sand cap that. The back 9 was the heavier part of the soil. So we dug that big sandy pit off the tee on 13 and basically mined sand out of there. So wherever we couldn't get sand on the site, we basically plated it. And we plated it with over a meter of sand, because there was a lot of studies done by Stuart and Chris Haspel saying if you get to a meter in depth, then you're even if below it's not sand, you're still going to get the conductivity. The water's going to pull through the root system, et cetera. So yeah, it was a really heavy sand cap. And then based on all of that, we were able to build. We found a good pit where we were able to get all the greens sand and build the greens out of that. So it was economical from the standpoint we used a lot of what was on site, but it would also ultimately give us the opportunity to replicate links playing conditions where they didn't naturally exist. There's 2 other things, Stuart, that really that we did that were interesting and experimental was the bunker style. We looked at Horace Hutchinson's book, British Golf Links, from the late 1800s, and tried to. There was a lot of the bunkers were really ragged and scruffy. They were revetted, but they also had this growth, and so we tried to kind of replicate that eroded look and feel. We called it the broken ground, as part of the code. And just brought the heather in and chunked heather on the faces and marram and just all this. Mark was great about giving this amazing palette of plant materials to try to play around with. So we tried to give the bunkers instead of that sort of clean revetted look, although some of them have that, we really tried to get this eroded feel as if the golf course had been there for ages and years and years. And I think some of the detail work that was done there, we still show, like when we did our presentation for the Olympic, to try and get the job for the Olympic course in Rio, we showed them pictures of some of the mounds that we had created at Castle Stuart with the heather on them, and just trying to say, listen, when nature doesn't give you something to work with, you can replicate nature if you really pay attention to the details. So the bunker, some photos of the bunkers and the mounding at Castle Stuart were a big part of our presentation for getting the job in Rio. And then the other thing that Mark really, I think, learned a bit of a lesson from Kings Barnes was the greens themselves and the slope of the greens, and not overdoing the contours internally. So we had big discussions about, when you think of most of the great links courses in the UK, the greens are generally fairly just tilted or sloped. Some of them have big undulations in them, but for the most part, they're just kind of sloped. And as a result, when the wind blows, you still have legitimate chance to putt instead of putting up and over or down these big humps and bumps, et cetera. But on the perimeter of the greens, the challenge was, listen, if you've missed the green, now you have to go up and over some humps and bumps. So we really did a lot more of the contouring and a lot more of the creativity. And Jim Wagner was the one who shaped a lot of the rumple, which is down sort of short right of the 14th green, and that became another part.
I was just going to mention 14, yeah.
That whole thing became just the talents of him on an excavator, and then the rest of us jumping on a sand pro. So it was really again part of what he had learned at Kings Barnes, and then applying that to Castle Stuart. So the greens there are not crazy contoured, but they've got enough tilt and enough interest to keep you honest when you're putting on them. But if you miss the greens, now you've really got a little bit of work to do.
And it goes back to that point we mentioned earlier about having some width off the tee. But even so, that doesn't mean if you get a drive in play that the hole's kind of, you're going to safely navigate the hole. I mean, the 14th in particular, I remember just pushing a drive up the right-hand side just into the right rough. And although I only had a pitch in of about 90 yards because of where the pin was and how severely contoured that green is, it's like, you'd rather be twice the distance away, but over on the left-hand side. And I think it's just fantastic to see courses that, are built, that are fairly, modern new courses that still incorporate those principles of angles and still having width off the tee. So,
it was, we had a big conversation on the 11th hole, the par 3 down the hill, that, originally there was a big deep bunker front right when we shaped it, and we talked again about hopeful and engaged. And if the average golfer hits it in that bunker and they're looking at the Murray Firth in the backdrop and then they scull it over the green, well, now they're not engaged, nor are they hopeful. Yeah. But if you put them in a tightly mown area, they're thinking, okay, I can putt this up there and I'm not going to putt it into the Murray Firth, hopefully. Or if I do, at least, shame on me. It's not like the architect, it's not a bad golf hole.
Yeah.
But for a good player or a tour pro, that's a much more difficult shot, putting off that tight mo or hitting or chip, thinking, do I chip it? Do I putt it? Do I flop it? So that became a hole where we said, listen, let's take the bunker away. Let's make it more playable for the average golfer, yet still more challenging. So there were a lot of those types of discussions out there where short grass, I know technically it's not I'm never going to say penalty area. It's always a hazard for me. So, technically short grass isn't a hazard, but it can be. And it's a hazard that is manageable for most everybody, that can play the game to a certain level. And so I think that makes it a much more interesting and thoughtful design. And then around the third green, we put those little sort of half moon revet stacks in the surrounds to complicate the chipping. And that was Jim Wagner. That was just him down there thing, kind of having fun. And then Mark really loved it. And it was just a different, instead of being able to putt everything, now you actually did have to chip around it or play around it, or it became a factor in your recovery, but not such a difficult one that you couldn't figure out how to play around them. So it's a lot of creativity in the surrounds that was really a big fun part of the fun of that project.
You said that you had a bit of a rerouting with 2 and 3. What was the thought process behind bringing that third hole to essentially a drivable par 4? But you'd have to be a fool like my friend Bruce here to ever go and driving it.
I literally had to buy a new lob wedge after going on those rocks and into the seaweed. I thought, this is a nice sort of plump patch of seaweed. Went down and had a look, and the leading edge was no more. But it's my own fault.
So I think a lot of that was the balance. That with the wind there can be pretty harsh in both, downwind, that hole could be into the wind or downwind, and then 16 being the other really short par 4 on the golf course played in the opposite direction. So it became on any given round, unless the wind switches on you, one of them's going to be downwind and one's going to be into the wind. And so it was a little bit more of the balance there. And that green site and the opportunity to build something, that juts out on that peninsula was really an interesting one. And then, again, further, the whole thought process, that green juts out on the peninsula, but then we built a landform so that when you walk off of the third green, you don't see the fourth hole until you come around this landform, and then there's the castle. And so Mark talked a lot about compression and release. It's like, okay, you're compressed into a space, and then when you come out of that space, boom, there's the view. And he particularly thought, if we get to a point where you are, you're on the third green and you look over there to the left and you see the castle, well, then you kind of don't get the thrill when you walk onto the fourth tee. So there was a lot of thinking along the organization of the site that way as well.
Yeah, that's. I think it almost applies to the course in general, though. It almost feels as if you are on your own separate kind of course, as it were, as you're playing each hole. There's not. You can't see like loads of different golfers across the property, for example. As you know, that phrase there, compression and release, is so apt, because I think you fully appreciate like the beauty of the hole that's right in front of you, because there's nothing else to really maybe distract you from it. And I guess the way, as you say, they're just, building those kind of landforms to maybe channel the golfer's focus. That's a neat look into just how much planning, I guess, goes into these holes.
Well, it's the one lesson that you learn eventually as a golf course architect. There's only one place on a golf course where you can put everybody and show them what you want them to see, and that's on the tee. Because once they're off the tee, they could be anywhere. They could be left, right, somewhere, so they're going to see all kinds of different views. But when they're on the tee, that's where you get to say, okay, now I'm showing you what I want you to see. And that could be focused on the views, or it could be, like we were discussing earlier, where something looks more difficult than it actually is. And we've kind of set that visual cue up that over a longer period of time, the more you play at Castle Stuart, you'll come back and go, okay, yeah, now I remember that I actually can go that way, and it's a good result. And we like to try to build, although it's a bit tricky when you try to do that a lot with private clubs where people are going to be repeat play over and over and again. But it's a bit difficult if you're trying to hide things on a place where people are going to come and play it maybe once. And then they might get a bad result, or they might not like that fact. They might not invest the time into really studying, or, upon multiple plays. And I think that's one of the things that Jim and I pride ourselves on. And I know Mark was really big on, was that courses that reward study are really generally good architectural golf courses. Like if you can show up on a golf course and the first time you play it and it's like, okay, everything's, I hate when the pros say, oh yeah, it's all right in front of me. I mean, that must be a design or the architect didn't care to hide anything, because think about all the great links courses, or think about all the great, Heathland courses. You don't ever figure them out the first time you play them. And that's a critical component of golf architecture. And when you're in sort of a please me today mentality, which some places are as a resort or a pay for play golf course, they might think that that's a risk not worth taking. But Mark was really, he wanted you to be enthralled or intrigued, or, the highest compliment you hear a lot of people say is when you walk off 18, you want to walk right to the first tee.
Yeah.
You want to do it again because you're like, okay, no, when I play that hole, next time I'm going to do this. And I think that's been the type of golf architecture that's always held our interest throughout the history of golf courses being created. And I don't know why anybody in this modern age would deviate from that.
No, I think for me, the highest regard I can give Castle Stuart is it's a golf course that I actually played particularly poorly. However, I walked off the 18th green and I'd had a great day. I'd had an absolutely fantastic day. And I think it's one of those courses that you can admire. I think a lot of courses are intrinsically linked to your performance. But I think Castle Stuart's one of those ones that I'll walk away and remember those views and the way that I played the hole. It didn't matter whether I played it well or not. It was just a great day out.
Yeah, that's great to hear, because you're right. So many of us confuse good design with the way we play. If you play well, you think it's a good golf course. If you play poorly, you think there must be, none of us want to be accountable for our own games. So we want to blame somebody else, either the superintendent or the architect. But it's nice. I think that's a difficult thing as well for a lot of touring pros. They are looking at a golf course through a very narrow prism of their own game, and their own game is really excellent. And so it's difficult for them to see how would the average golfer play this hole, or even take time to think about it. And I think that the best touring pros who become golf architects actually can cover that ground. Ben Crenshaw, Jeff Ogilvy, those guys are really good at seeing not only just the prism of their own game, but seeing how everybody else might ultimately appreciate the golf course's setup.
Yeah, I feel like I sound like a broken record here, but it's I guess so many courses that you mentioned there, Gil, like ex-professional players who've played at a really high level. So many of the courses that I guess we see on TV are penal off the tee, and for the average golfer, that's just so demoralizing. And as Tom says there, like it's difficult to walk away from a course that's really penal off the tee where you've lost a bunch of golf balls and have a good day, because you just never feel like you're in the hole. And even if you get to a course like Castle Stuart where there are some really difficult undulations around the greens and you make a fool of yourself around by the greens, well, at least you feel like you've stayed in the hole until you got to the green, and at least you had a fighting chance kind of going in. But if you don't have that off the tee, then you're never at the races to begin with. And yeah, I played okay at Castle Stuart, but again, walked off the 18th and just thought, like, if it wasn't pitch black, I'd definitely love to go and play that again now, because the appreciation of like angles and different ways to play the course was I got that from just one round there, and I imagine that if you were playing that over and over, you'd never tire of learning the different kind of ways to play it and the different quirks, etc.
Yeah, if you guys, or if people who are listening to this don't remember anything what I said, but that hopeful and engaged.
Yeah.
Think about next time you play golf. Was I hopeful with the shots I was hitting? Was I inspired by them? And did I stay engaged through the entire golf course, or was I done? Did I check out after certain hole?
Yeah. Just pivoting ever so slightly, Gil, being a current working golf course architect and this whole issue with distance and everything that's going on in the game, this thing has a direct impact on your job and what you can produce. Do you have, are you consulted by the USGA and the R&A about how this affects, the building of golf courses and how it affects golf going forward? Is that something you've been involved in?
I think they've reached out to a number of golf architects when they did their study for the distance study that was released, and I did participate and give them some ideas, and we've had a lot of really good dialogue with the USGA in particular, because we've been fortunate to be involved in two fronts, involved in the restoration of a lot of courses that are hosting major championships, but also I had a 5-year run on Fox Sports doing the commentary for the U.S. Open. So I was always, there to kind of learn, and even if we hadn't been involved in the golf course. So it was kind of fun to walk around and listen to them talk about setup in preparation for trying to sound intelligent on television. So it was one of those that they understand, our thoughts on it. It's one of those, I don't envy anybody who's going to have to be involved in that decision making, because you're going to make somebody upset somewhere along the lines. But my own personal thoughts are that the vast majority of golfers, myself included, don't need to have anybody regulate the equipment for me. And I think that from that standpoint, it's probably looking at some level of bifurcation, because it's the gap between the guys who play this and the guys who play it at the highest level is just getting wider and wider and wider, and they can maximize everything, the equipment they have, their training. They are better athletes. I know some people kind of say that tongue in cheek, but they really are. Everything they do, we talked about the predictable outcome. Well, when you have all the equipment and the ability to, through computers and TrackMan and basically maximize the golf ball and the clubs and the shafts and everything to their swings, and they have the ability to work for 6 or 8 hours a day on maximizing that, it's no surprise we're getting the results that we're getting with them. And now with Bryson taking the route he's taking and trying to change his body shape and type and launch speeds, etc. There's a whole new school of thought. So I think that from that standpoint, the part of the distance debate that's always, I think, been underserved is the environmental part of it. It's just the lengthening of golf courses, the amount of fertilizer, water in particular required to maintain a golf course is 7,700 yards long. The amount of time it takes to maintain a golf course like that for such a small fraction of people who play the game. And so I think that if we could see something either done with, I've actually heard somebody recently put forward, limiting the tee, the length of the tee, or even eliminating the tee for players of that caliber. Or limiting it to 1.5 inches or 2 inches, and making them have to tee it up so high. That was an interesting take. I'm not sure that anybody's done a study on that, but I think it ultimately could come down to sort of a competition ball, where the rules of the competition dictate that you're going to play an 80% ball, a 90% ball, 100% ball. And then that would allow the PGA Tour, at least in the States, to say, hey, we want to showcase these guys at the best. And every week they tee it up, they can play 100% ball. They can play the same ball. But if the USGA and the RNA or some local governing body wants to take a championship to a course that's perhaps not long enough, and a club that thankfully resists adding yardage where it doesn't make sense, then I think they could scale things down. But I don't have a crystal ball to see where things are going to go, but I think something has to be done for the players at the highest level.
Yeah, I just think for you personally, I think it must be so difficult for you. It's kind of like designing a puzzle that you would like a child to complete and a genius to complete, and to do it in roughly the same amount of time. And it's got to be so difficult to work under those constraints. And I think, there's courses like, bringing it back to courses like Castle Stuart, where you have managed to do that, it just shows how skilled that you guys are as architects, that you can put these courses together.
Well, I fit definitely more into the child putting the puzzle.
We all do, Gil.
So from that standpoint, I think it's, and in a way it's counter to, we get paid money to figure out ways to lengthen golf courses. So, if anything, we should be rooting for it to continue. But I think just for the betterment of the game, something's got to be done. I mean, we're getting to a point where, especially a lot of these great old golf courses, we Jim and I talk a lot about, not wanting to disconnect. What we love about so many of these courses that were built in the teens and the 20s is that there's a compact nature to them. You walk off the green and you're pretty much right on the next tee. And to lengthen it, I hate the thought of sort of having to walk back 80 or 90 yards, tee it off, and then walk those same 80 or 90 yards to come back, because they don't have the elasticity in them to basically have been designed with a thought process that they might ultimately have to be 7,500 yards to be a challenge for the top players. So I think we're in danger of losing those golf courses. And I know, consulting at places like Winged Foot, and you can't really go back any further. I mean, we've pushed the envelope to a point where that's pretty much it. That I don't see us gaining another 100 to 200 yards if the U.S. Open comes back there before the end of this decade or at the start of the next decade, and things just keep going the way they are. We don't have a magic 300 yards to add Winged Foot. It just doesn't exist in that footprint any longer.
Yeah, I mean, just talk about Winged Foot for a second longer there, Gil. So that's I guess would be considered a golden age at course, a Tillinghast design. He himself, I think I'm correct in saying, he was a very good player, member of the Philadelphia school with the likes of Crump and Hugh Wilson, who are all very good players in their own right. Do you think, back when they were playing golf in the 20s and slightly before then, if they were going around somewhere like a Winged Foot and shooting, in the mid 70s, the kind of regular casual golfers would just be going around and shooting 100 back then? And I guess there's always been maybe a big gap between the top players of the day and the recreational golfers. And maybe that's been accentuated a little bit through technology and slightly different training regimens nowadays. But do you think maybe the ability to build a golf course that's appealing to all has maybe that's just a sort of romantic idea that we've never it's never really existed?
Well, I think it comes down to, ultimately what a lot of people don't think about is, what is the client asking you to do as a golf architect? We're not designing these for ourselves, or, we obviously have ideas and thoughts that are coming into them. But when Mark Parsinen hires you to build a golf course with him and maximize views and maximize playability and all the things we've talked about, well, that's a different set of circumstances than when the New York Athletic Club or the people who spun off out of the New York Athletic Club hired A.W. Tillinghast and, said, we want a really challenging, difficult golf course, and we want you to build something hard. And that's what it is. Or when somebody at Streamsong hires us to do the third golf course and says, listen, we've got two wonderful golf courses. We want something different. We want something more difficult, more challenging. And Jim and I put our minds to how do we do that without still keeping golfers hopeful and engaged and not putting them rough or water. Then that's a different mindset than a guy who Michael Walrath hires us to design a Ohoopee Match Club, which you're never going to write a score down. It's all about match play. And so there are different edicts that come from the client that ultimately if we design a golf course that we love and think is great and the client or the owner hates it, well, what have we accomplished? We haven't done our job. So I think that even through history, there have been places like Winged Foot, Oakmont that were identified back in 100 years ago to be the ultimate test or ultimate challenge. And now maybe you look at a place like Erin Hills now that has the opportunity to expand to 8,000 yards, and maybe that was designed to be the ultimate challenge or test for this modern era. So I think through the history, Bruce, you made a good point. There's always been a disparity between people who play it at the highest level and people who just play it recreationally. But I think, and I don't know how, it's just anecdotally, I don't know how to prove it, but I think there are people who put statistics together that shows that the gap is wider now than it ever has been because of the technology and the implements we play with.
You touched there, just as a parting gift, Gil, I'm conscious of we've taken far too much of your time already, but you've touched there on Ohoopee Match Club, which is obviously a fascinating story in itself. Does the designing of a course like that allow you to be way more flexible in terms of what you can do because it's designed principally for match play?
Yeah, definitely. I think the word that Jim and I use it was liberating. I mean, it was, you thought about nobody was going to write down an 8 on their scorecard and think that either the hole was bad or the architects were bad. It was just, you lost the hole, you move on. And I think it gave us the opportunity to focus on, we a lot of people talk about the penal school of architecture, the strategic school, but the heroic school was kind of lost in there. It seemed to be something that Robert Trent Jones advocated a lot of, but that the risks and the rewards were magnified. There were big risks, big rewards. And I think that from the standpoint of the site that we had to work with at Ohoopee and the sandy nature of it, really allowed us to build something where you could, if you were 2 down and you wanted to push the event, you could. But if you didn't pull it off, you're going to be 3 down. And if you were 2 up, you could basically say, I'm going to take the safe route and play it this way. So it's that entire perspective and the mindset of playing match versus, the tension that creeps into our minds when, oh my God, I got this for double bogey. I've just basically ruined my entire round. And talk about not being engaged. If you're a really good player and you're 4 over through 6 holes, you're probably already checked out. Because you're thinking, all right, I'm not going to play very well here. So I think it was that whole mindset of creating Michael Walrath gave us the most amazing piece of land to work with, and then the most amazing set of directions that I think allowed us to create a golf course that we felt freer to maybe take some risks or take some chances, which is always a nice thing.
Well, Gil, you've been very, very generous with your time, and thank you so much for coming on and chatting to us about Castle Stuart and everything else that we've had an opportunity to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Keep doing what you're doing. I love that there are these sorts of podcasts out there and people who are excited about golf architecture and about golf courses and doing the right thing for the game. So keep it up. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks, Gil. Thank you very much.
Watch
Thanks, Gil.
this.